Corporal Jalen Marek heard the sound before he saw the light. It started as a low vibration in the ground beneath him. Not an explosion, not artillery, but something deeper. Something that came from above the clouds. A slow, rolling thunder that the atmosphere swallowed and spat back out in pieces. He already knew what it was. Everyone on Arkenfall learned that sound quickly. It meant another city had just stopped existing. Jalen sat with his back against the cracked wall of a ruined transport station, rifle resting across his knees, and watched the distant horizon pulse with cold white light. The sky flickered like something enormous was breathing behind the clouds. Then the echoes came rolling across the plains, one after another, until they faded into the ash-gray dark. Across the trench, a younger recruit was staring upward. He couldn't have been more than 19. His helmet sat slightly too large on his head, and he held his weapon with the careful grip of someone who hadn't yet learned to stop thinking about it. His name was Davin. He had been in the trench for 6 days. He was watching the faint streaks of burning debris fall through the clouds like dying stars. "Is that ours or theirs?" he asked quietly. Jalen followed the falling fire with his eyes. "Doesn't matter," he said. Davin looked at him. Jalen shrugged. "Either way, it's bad news." Davin nodded slowly, the way people did when they already understood something but hadn't yet made peace with it. Most people learned quickly on Arkenfall. Jalen had been on the planet for 8 months. By the standards of the war, that made him ancient. 8 months was a very long time to survive here. He rubbed tired eyes and looked out at the dark plain beyond the trench line. The older soldiers talked sometimes, in the quiet minutes between artillery rounds, about what Arkenfall had once looked like. Long silver rivers that cut across the continents like shining threads. Forests so wide that a person could walk for weeks without seeing the same tree twice. Floating cities that hung above the ocean like quiet constellations of glass and light. None of the younger soldiers had seen those things. What they knew of Arkenfall was ash. The forests were gone, burned down to blackened skeletons that clawed at the sky like the ribs of a dead animal. The rivers ran thick and gray with the dust of shattered mountains. The floating cities had fallen months ago, their broken pieces scattered across the plains like fragments of a shattered mirror. And somewhere out there, hidden in the smoke and ruins, the enemy was moving again. They always moved eventually. Another flash lit the clouds. Another distant impact rolled across the plains. Davin swallowed hard. "Do you think we can still win?" he asked. Jalen didn't answer immediately. Across the trench, several veteran soldiers exchanged glances but said nothing. Everyone had heard the same rumors lately. Reports from command. Statistics passed quietly between officers. Numbers that didn't look good no matter how you arranged them. He looked back at the recruit. In the pale light of the burning sky, the boy's face looked very young. For a moment Jalen considered lying. Then he shook his head slightly. "I don't know," he said. Davin looked down at his hands. Neither of them spoke again for a while. High above the planet, unseen behind the thick cloud cover, the enemy fleet continued its slow, relentless advance. And in the command centers of the Galactic Coalition, the best military minds in the known galaxy were beginning to understand something they had never imagined possible. The war for Arkenfall might already be lost. The war had begun 2 years earlier. The first reports had sounded almost routine, an unknown fleet entering remote systems, small colonies going silent, patrol ships failing to return. The Galactic Coalition had faced threats before. For 400 years, the great alliance of civilizations had protected the spiral arm. 7 advanced species, each with fleets, armies, and technology powerful enough to break most enemies before they even reached populated worlds. For centuries, nothing had seriously challenged them. Then the enemy arrived. Nobody was entirely sure where they had come from. The first survivors to encounter them gave only fragmented descriptions, delivered in the broken voices of people who had seen something their minds hadn't fully processed yet. Ships that moved like living things, they said. Soldiers that never hesitated. Waves and waves of them, advancing without fear, without rest, without any visible emotion at all. There was one account, recorded by a colony administrator on a world called Varesh Prime, transmitted 7 minutes before all contact was lost, that coalition archivists would study for years afterward. The administrator's voice was calm, which made it worse. She described watching an entire battalion of enemy soldiers walk directly into concentrated defensive fire without breaking stride. Not charging, not running. Simply walking forward at a steady pace, like a machine executing a program, while their comrades died around them in dozens, then hundreds. They don't stop, she had said, in what would be her final transmission. They just don't stop. At first, the coalition assumed it was simply another empire, some aggressive civilization expanding too quickly for its own good. Empires could be defeated. Empires could be negotiated with. Empires could collapse. But the enemy that came to be known as the Dominion was not an empire. It was something else, something colder, something that did not think in the way most species understood thinking. And by the time the coalition realized that, 3-star systems had already fallen, including Varesh Prime, and the 2 populated worlds that orbited with it, and the combined population of 11 billion people who had once called that corner of the galaxy home. On Arkenfall, the war had reached its worst stage. The planet had once been a major transportation hub, a crossroads for trade and diplomacy between several coalition worlds. Its orbital platforms had been famous for their beauty, long rings of crystal towers and docking arms that caught the light of the system's blue star like a crown. Those platforms were gone now. The Dominion fleet had destroyed them during the first week of the invasion. Since then, the battle had moved slowly downward, layer by layer, like a storm grinding through the atmosphere. First orbit, then the skies, then the cities, now the ground. The coalition had thrown everything it had into the defense of Arkenfall. Warships from 5 different species filled the orbit above the planet. Millions of soldiers fought across its continents. And still the front lines kept moving in the wrong direction. Forward for the enemy, backward for everyone else. High above the burning surface of Arkenfall, the war looked very different. Down on the planet, soldiers saw trenches, ruined cities, and the slow grind of enemy ground forces through smoke and shattered streets. Up in orbit, the conflict unfolded across thousands of kilometers of empty black space, where fleets moved like drifting constellations and weapons crossed the darkness at the speed of light. At the center of the coalition command formation hung the flagship Resolute Mind, a Sarati vessel designed for one purpose: thinking. Unlike most warships, the Resolute Mind carried fewer weapons and heavier computational cores. It was a floating network of strategy chambers, analysis engines, and tactical modeling systems where the coalition's best minds worked together to understand the war. Inside the main command hall, dozens of display screens floated in midair like transparent windows, each showing a different part of the battle. Fleet formations, supply routes, enemy movements, casualty projections. The numbers changed constantly. Every hour, they became worse. General Orten of the Sarati stood at the center of the room, watching the projections scroll across a curved display that stretched from floor to ceiling. The Sarati were known throughout the coalition for their minds, tall, thin, and pale-skinned, with 4 long arms and eyes that shifted in subtle patterns while calculating. They had spent centuries refining the science of strategy. A Sarati commander did not rely on instinct or emotion. They relied on numbers. And the numbers in front of Orten told a very simple story. They were losing. He extended one narrow hand and shifted the display. A cluster of glowing points appeared, representing the Dominion fleet currently occupying the Arkenfall system. The formation was enormous, hundreds of warships arranged in dense, layered clusters around a central core of larger vessels. Every few seconds, new signals appeared at the edge of the system. More reinforcements. Always more. Another wave, a coalition officer asked nearby. Orten nodded once. 212 vessels. The officer exhaled slowly. That makes 863 confirmed ships currently in the system. Orten finished calmly. Our fleet numbers barely 500. Silence settled across the command hall. But numbers alone were not what made the enemy terrifying. Orten adjusted the display. A second projection appeared beside the fleet map, casualty statistics. Coalition ships destroyed during the past 14 months of war. The graph climbed upward like a mountain. Dominion losses were displayed beside it. Their line rose much more slowly. One of the Dravathi commanders leaned closer. That can't be right. It is correct, Orten replied. But we've won battles. Yes, and every victory costs more than it should. He enlarged the Dominion casualty graph. We destroy their ships, but they replace them faster than we destroy them. Another screen showed something even worse. Production estimates. Entire planets covered in vast industrial structures, manufacturing facilities producing soldiers, drones, and warships at a scale no coalition civilization had ever attempted. And the production never slowed. Unlike most societies, the Dominion had no civilian population to protect. Everything it controlled existed for one purpose: war. How are they coordinating all of this? A commander asked. Through the hive. The words came from Commander Thex of the Velhari species. He folded his thick blue arms and studied the enemy formation. We've recovered biological samples from several battlefields, he continued. Every Dominion soldier is connected to a shared neural network. Not through communication systems, through direct neural signals. They do not think as individuals. They think as a single mind, Orten confirmed. He brought up a new projection, a simplified diagram of the Dominion control system. At its center was something enormous, a massive biological processing core known as the hive. Every soldier, every drone, every ship crew, all of them connected to it. All of them executing the same thought at the same moment. The implications had become painfully clear during 2 years of war. Dominion soldiers never hesitated. They never panicked. They never retreated unless the hive calculated retreat to be mathematically optimal. If 1,000 soldiers died, the hive adjusted its battle plan and continued without pause. If 10,000 died, it did the same thing. Fear was a personal emotion, and the Dominion had no individuals. How fast does the hive process tactical data? Thex asked. Approximately 3,000 tactical adjustments per second across the entire fleet, Orten replied. The room went quiet. 3,000. A human brain might struggle to process a single complex decision in that time. The Dominion was making thousands. Simultaneously. Across every ship, every soldier, every drone. All executing the same strategy, all adjusting together, perfectly and instantly. One mind. Millions of bodies. Perfect coordination. Orten shifted the final display onto the main screen. The long-term war projection. If the current trend continued, the coalition would lose Arkenfall within 3 months. 6 months later, 3 additional systems would fall. Within 5 years, Dominion fleets would reach the inner coalition worlds. No model showed a different outcome. The numbers had been checked hundreds of times by the best analysts in the galaxy. They all reached the same conclusion. Commander Thex stared at the projection. So what you're saying, he said quietly, is that the Dominion cannot be defeated. Orten did not respond immediately. Sarati commanders were careful with words. No, he said at last. That is not what I am saying. Then what are you saying? Orten looked at the casualty statistics, at the production estimates, at the long-term projections. When he spoke again, his voice remained calm. But the words settled into the room like stones dropped into still water. I am saying that according to every mathematical model we possess, this war cannot be won. The War Council gathered 12 hours after General Orthan's report. They met in the central chamber of the Coalition Command Station, a massive circular hall designed to hold representatives from every member species of the Alliance. The ceiling rose high in a smooth silver dome, and at its center hung a rotating projection of the Arkenfall system. Normally the chamber was a place of careful diplomacy. Now it felt like a room waiting for bad news to make itself official. Orten delivered the same briefing again. The numbers did not change. When he finished, the chamber was silent. Then the arguments began. Commander Thex was first to stand. The Velhari officer was a large figure even by the standards of his physically powerful species, and he leaned forward over the table with restrained intensity. You are presenting a mathematical conclusion. Mathematics assumes perfect conditions. War does not occur under perfect conditions. Correct, Orten replied. But the projections have been accurate for 2 years. Admiral Carew of the Dravathi spoke next, an older commander whose species had been exploring the stars for thousands of years before most coalition civilizations had discovered fire. His voice was slow and deliberate, the voice of someone who had fought in more wars than most people in the room could name. We have defeated enemies that appeared unstoppable before, he said. Yes, Orten agreed. But never, Carew said quietly, an enemy like this. A murmur of agreement passed through the chamber. Everyone understood the difference. Most enemies in the galaxy were predictable. They had governments, leaders, political disagreements, strategic pride. things that could be leveraged. They made mistakes. They argued with each other. They feared dying. The Dominion did none of those things. One by one, the commanders lowered their eyes to the table. Orthan activated the display again, showing alternative battle plans, revised fleet formations, experimental tactics. Every scenario ended the same way. Defeat. We have lost 9 major engagements in the last 14 months, Karu said quietly. 3-star systems. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers. And every time we fight them, they come back stronger. No one argued. The facts were too clear. Then a voice spoke from the far end of the chamber. It belonged to Ambassador Saravel. Unlike most people in the room, Saravel was not a soldier. He was a diplomat, and for 2 years he had watched military commanders debate strategies while entire worlds burned. He had attended dozens of meetings exactly like this one. Most ended the same way. More plans. More ships sent into battle. More losses. He had spent months preparing what he was about to say. He had rehearsed it privately, quietly, knowing that most people in the room would dismiss it. But the room was silent. And silence, in his experience, meant the door was open. There may be one option we have not tried, he said. Several heads turned. There is a species, he continued, located in the outer spiral territories. Not currently members of the coalition. They have been observed for some time, but until now they have not been considered suitable partners for large-scale military cooperation. Why not? Admiral Karu asked. Because they are young. Thex leaned forward. How young? Less than 2 centuries of spaceflight. Several skeptical looks passed around the table. 200 years was nothing in galactic history. Some of the civilizations in this room had been exploring the stars for millennia. A species with 2 centuries of spaceflight experience, Thex said flatly, is not going to help us defeat the Dominion. Perhaps not, Saravel agreed. Then why bring them up? Saravel glanced at the projection of the Dominion fleet hanging above the chamber. The answer was simple. They had already tried everything else. Because we have exhausted every option we understand. The room was silent again. Longer this time. You are suggesting we request military assistance from this species, Orthan said. Yes. What is the species called? Saravel hesitated only slightly. Humans. Several commanders exchanged confused looks. The name meant little to most of them. One of the younger officers spoke. I've seen brief reports. Small population. Limited territory. Moderate technological development. Commander Thex nodded. They are considered aggressive by regional standards. Saravel allowed a faint smile. That is one way to describe them. Admiral Karu studied him carefully. You believe they can change the outcome of this war? Saravel did not answer immediately. He had spent months studying the historical records of this strange young species. Their wars, their disasters, their recoveries, their peculiar, persistent habit of surviving situations that logic said should destroy them. I don't know if they can, he said honestly. Then why suggest them at all? Thex asked. Saravel leaned forward slightly. Because, he said quietly, we are losing a war that every rational calculation says we should lose. He gestured toward the Dominion fleet projection. Perhaps what we need now is something irrational. The chamber remained silent. Admiral Karu spoke first. If we contact them, what exactly would we ask for? Help, Saravel said simply. Thex exhaled through his nose. A desperate request to a young species we barely understand. Yes. And if they refuse? Then nothing changes. General Orthan looked around the chamber. He saw exhaustion on many faces. Fear on some. But also something else. A quiet recognition that the Council had reached the edge of its options. Very well, he said. We will send the signal. Within the hour, a transmission array on the outer edge of the system began preparing a message. It would travel across dozens of light years through empty space, toward a small blue world orbiting an ordinary yellow star. A world whose people had no idea that 7 ancient civilizations were about to ask them for help. The message left Arkenfall in the quiet hours of the morning. From the outside, the transmission looked insignificant, a narrow beam of encoded light vanishing into deep space. Compared to the scale of the war raging across the system, it was almost invisible. But inside the message was something rare, a request for help. For several days after it was sent, the war did not pause. Dominion forces advanced through another ruined city. 2 coalition battalions were forced to retreat, when their defensive lines collapsed under continuous drone assaults. In orbit, 3 coalition cruisers were destroyed attempting to block a Dominion reinforcement wave. And still there was no reply. Ambassador Saravel spent the waiting time reviewing the same files he had studied dozens of times before. Records about humanity. Compared to the detailed archives most coalition civilizations kept, the files were surprisingly chaotic. Human history was not a smooth sequence of progress and stability like that of older species. It was messy, violent, unpredictable. Saravel scrolled through centuries of recorded conflicts. He paused on one in particular, a planetary conflict that had occurred roughly 300 years before humans reached space. 2 opposing blocks of nations, consuming nearly every major civilization on the planet in a war that lasted several years and left entire regions reduced to rubble. The casualty estimates, by coalition standards, were almost incomprehensible. And yet within 2 generations, those same nations had rebuilt, formed new alliances, advanced their technology at remarkable speed, and begun the process of reaching for the stars. A species that had nearly destroyed itself had instead used the catastrophe as fuel. He found another account even more striking. A century before that global war, an epidemic had swept across their world and killed tens of millions in less than 2 years. The response had been fragmented, chaotic, and in some regions catastrophically inadequate. And yet in the aftermath, human medical science had advanced faster in the following 50 years than in the previous 500. Disaster, for this species, seemed to function as a kind of accelerant. Again and again, human society had reached moments where extinction or collapse seemed almost inevitable. And each time, they had recovered. Not gracefully, not perfectly, but they survived. That pattern was what had first caught Saravel's attention. Most civilizations in the galaxy followed relatively stable development paths. Growth was steady. Institutions evolved slowly over centuries. Humans were different. They lurched forward, sometimes violently, sometimes irrationally, but always forward. Saravel had tried many times to describe this to the War Council. He had never found the right words. Humans were not the most intelligent species in the galaxy. The Sorati surpassed them in pure analytical ability. They were not the strongest. Several coalition species possessed far greater physical endurance. They were not the most technologically advanced. Many civilizations had mastered space travel thousands of years before humanity. By every traditional measurement used to evaluate military potential, humans should have been considered minor participants in galactic affairs. And yet something about them made Saravel uneasy, or perhaps intrigued. He opened a series of reports written by coalition observers who had studied human military culture. The conclusions were consistent across multiple analysts. Human soldiers showed unusual psychological traits compared to most coalition forces. High tolerance for physical stress, high adaptability in chaotic environments, strong loyalty to small unit groups, a tendency to fight harder, not because of orders or doctrine, but because of the specific people standing beside them. And one other trait that every observer had noted, in different words, but with the same quiet bewilderment. One line had been underlined several times by previous analysts. Humans display a persistent refusal to accept failure as a final outcome. Saravel stared at the sentence for a long time. Across the command chamber, General Orten approached quietly. "You are studying them again," the Sorati said. "I am trying to understand them." Orten observed the records scrolling across the screen with the focused expression Sorati displayed when calculating. From a purely strategic perspective, their history is extremely inefficient. In many ways, Saravel agreed. Frequent internal conflict, unstable political systems, high casualty tolerance. Yes, I do not see evidence that they possess any unique technological or strategic advantage. They don't. Then why do you believe they may influence the outcome of the war? Saravel closed the display. "That," he said, "is the problem. I cannot explain it." Orten considered this. For a species that valued logic above all else, uncertainty was deeply uncomfortable. And yet you recommended contacting them. "Yes. Your reasoning appears inconsistent." "I know." They stood quietly for a moment. Outside the command station windows, the battle in orbit continued. Tiny flashes of light marking distant ship engagements across the blackness of space. After a while, Orten asked another question. What is the defining characteristic of this species? Saravel thought about it. He could have answered with many different things. Human creativity, human aggression, human adaptability, their strange capacity to love things they had never met and mourn strangers they would never know, their habit of naming things, every mountain, every river, every star they could see with their unaided eyes, as if naming something was a way of claiming a relationship with it. But none of those words quite captured the feeling he had when studying their history. They keep getting back up, he said. Orten looked at him. Explain. Saravel opened the display again. Wars, disasters, near collapses, moments where, by any rational expectation, their civilization should have ended. And after each one, recovery, rebuilding, progress. They fail, Saravel said. Frequently. But they do not stop. Statistically unusual, Orten said. Very. Logically inefficient. Extremely. Yet successful. Yes. Orten considered the idea carefully. Then he asked the question that had been quietly forming in the minds of many coalition leaders since the signal had been sent. If they respond, what exactly do you expect them to do? Saravel looked back at the battle unfolding outside the station. Another coalition ship disappeared in a brief flash of light. The Dominion fleet continued its slow, relentless advance. I have no idea, he admitted. Orten watched the battle for several seconds. Then he said something unusual, something no one expected from a Sarati general. A variable that cannot be calculated. Yes, Saravel said. A communication officer suddenly turned from her console. Ambassador, we just received a reply. The room went still. Display it. A new signal appeared on the main screen. Origin, Sol System. Message classification, response. For a moment no one spoke. Then Saravel said quietly. They answered. The first human ships arrived 9 days later. At first, nobody noticed. The outer sensor arrays detected a small disturbance at the edge of the system, a single faint signal dropping out of hyperspace beyond the main engagement zone. The officer monitoring long-range sensors glanced at it briefly. New contact, she said. The statement was routine. She marked the signal and waited for the computer to identify it. The system hesitated, then displayed something unexpected. Unknown vessel configuration. She frowned. Command, we have a ship entering the system that does not match any coalition database. Several heads turned. General Orten stepped closer to the console. The screen magnified the distant contact. It was small by fleet standards, but the silhouette looked strange. Coalition warships were built with careful symmetry, their hulls following precise design philosophies refined over centuries of engineering tradition. Every section of a vessel balanced against the others. This ship was not balanced. Large weapon structures protruded from one side of the hull. Additional armor plates had been welded onto the outer frame in uneven layers. The engines burned hotter than any coalition design would normally allow. It looked like something built under pressure by people who had prioritized function so aggressively they had simply discarded elegance entirely. Identification? Orten asked. A transponder code is broadcasting. It identifies the vessel as human. A few minutes later, the scanners detected a second hyperspace disturbance. Then another. Then another. More signals appeared across the edge of the system, each one dropping out of hyperspace within seconds of the last. The sensor officer's eyes widened slightly. Multiple arrivals. 10, 20, 50. The tactical screen continued filling with new signals. Within 3 minutes, the display was crowded with dozens of incoming contacts. Saravel leaned closer. That is more than I expected. Sir, the arrivals are still continuing. 100 ships. 200. 300. The room grew very quiet. More ships appeared, in long waves, forming clusters that expanded across the outer system like spreading ripples in water. 400. 500. 600. When the arrivals finally stopped, the sensor officer leaned back from her console. Total confirmed human ships and system. She hesitated while the computer finished calculating. 712. The silence in the command center became absolute. Commander Thex stared at the display. They brought an armada. But the numbers were not the only thing that drew attention. As the tactical displays zoomed closer to the new arrivals, coalition officers began noticing something else. The ships looked strange. Coalition warships were elegant machines, smooth hulls, balanced structures. weapons carefully integrated into the design. Human ships looked nothing like that. Many appeared heavily modified. Sections of armor plating clearly added after original construction. Weapon systems mounted in places where Coalition engineers would never place them. Some ships had entire external structures attached to their hulls. Massive rail cannons, missile pods, and sensor arrays that appeared almost improvised. One officer shook her head slowly. That design violates at least 30 standard engineering principles. Commander Thex crossed his arms. 42. Heat output from those engines is far above safe operational limits. That one, another officer said, zooming in on a larger vessel near the center, has two completely different propulsion systems installed. Why would they do that? Someone asked. No one answered, but there was something else visible in the sensor readings. Power. Enormous energy signatures pulsed through their weapon systems. Reinforced hull structures suggested they could survive damage that would cripple most Coalition vessels. And every single one of them was moving toward the Dominion fleet. Without hesitation, a communication alert sounded. Incoming transmission from the human flagship. Orten nodded. Put it on screen. The main display flickered. A moment later, the image of a human appeared. She was older than Saravel had expected, perhaps in her 50s, with short gray hair framing a weathered face marked by decades of hard decisions. Her expression was calm in the specific way of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by difficult situations. One of her arms was mechanical from the elbow down, a cybernetic replacement made of dark metal and reinforced joints. She held it slightly away from her body, not self-consciously, but with the casual ease of someone who had spent years learning to treat it as simply part of herself. She studied the Coalition command chamber through the screen. Then she spoke. Coalition Command. This is General Mara Voss of the Terran Expeditionary Fleet. Her voice was steady and direct, the voice of someone who had given orders in rooms full of chaos and expected them to be followed. We received your message. Saravel stepped forward. General Voss, I am Ambassador Saravel of the Galactic Coalition. Good. She nodded once. Then we can skip the introductions. Her eyes shifted briefly to the tactical display showing the Dominion fleet. That looks like a serious problem. It is, Thex confirmed. Voss studied the display for several seconds. Then, give me the situation. Saravel began explaining. Dominion fleet strength. Hive coordination. Coalition losses. Enemy production capacity. He had delivered the same briefing to every commander who arrived in the system. Most reacted with visible concern or disbelief, or the particular stillness of someone absorbing information that frightened them. Voss did neither. She simply listened. Her expression never changed. When Saravel finished, the room waited for her response. Instead, she asked a single question. How long can your ground forces hold the planet? Orten stepped forward. Statistically speaking, no additional time alters the outcome. Voss looked directly at him. General, give me a number. A pause. 60 days. Maybe 70 under ideal conditions. Voss nodded once. Good. Thex blinked. Good. That's enough time. For what? Saravel asked. She looked out at the massive Dominion fleet slowly advancing toward the inner system. Then she turned back to the screen. For us, she said calmly, to break them. The human fleet moved within minutes of General Voss ending the transmission. Coalition commanders had expected a careful formation. Standard battle doctrine called for fleets to organize into layered defensive lines, coordinating movements through centralized command systems to maintain tactical precision. Every major coalition species approached fleet combat the same way, methodically, predictably, with clear chains of command and established response protocols. Human ships did not do that. Instead, the fleet scattered. Hundreds of vessels broke apart into smaller groups, accelerating toward the Dominion formation from multiple directions at once. Some moved in tight clusters of 5 or 6. Others traveled alone, racing ahead of the main formation at speeds coalition safety regulations would normally forbid. From the perspective of the tactical displays, the movement looked like organized chaos, which, Saravel would later come to understand, was precisely the point. Commander Thex stared at the screen. What are they doing? They are abandoning formation, Orten said. That is obvious. But why? Then the Dominion fleet reacted, and the answer began to become visible. Enemy vessels shifted positions, adjusting their formations to intercept the incoming ships. As always, the hive mind moved with flawless coordination. Thousands of Dominion drones surged forward. The battle began almost instantly. The first human destroyer crossed into Dominion firing range and was hit by a concentrated burst of particle weapons. The blast ripped through part of its hull, tearing away armor plating and sending fragments spinning into space. Coalition officers watching the engagement expected the ship to pull back, assess the damage, regroup. Instead, it accelerated. The damaged destroyer fired a full spread of railgun projectiles directly into the advancing Dominion drones, destroying several in a single violent burst, then veered sharply sideways and continued deeper into enemy territory, trailing debris and venting atmosphere from a hull breach that hadn't been sealed. Commander Thex blinked. They're charging the formation. On the surface of Arkenfall, Corporal Jalen Marek saw the sky change. The constant flashes of orbital bombardment had grown brighter. The intervals between them had shortened. Something different was happening up there. Not the slow, methodical exchange of the past 8 months, but something faster, louder, more violent, and less predictable. Davin pointed upward at a cascade of burning debris falling through the cloud cover, trailing fire in irregular spirals. "What's happening up there?" he asked. A nearby communications officer received an update from orbit. He read it twice before speaking. "Human fleet engaging Dominion forces." "Humans," someone said. "I thought they were a minor species." Another explosion rolled across the sky. Jalen watched the clouds flash with distant weapons fire, brighter than anything he'd seen in months. "Minor or not," he said quietly, "they're fighting like they mean it." Back in orbit, the battle had grown into something no coalition commander had ever seen. Human squadrons were not simply attacking, they were experimenting. One unit intentionally allowed itself to be targeted by multiple Dominion ships at once, drawing their concentrated fire, while 2 other human ships slipped behind the formation and struck the exposed engines of a larger enemy cruiser. Another group split apart mid-engagement, half retreating, the other half suddenly accelerating directly through a narrow gap in the Dominion line that had opened up in response to the retreat. A trio of frigates weaved through incoming fire in patterns so irregular that Orthan's tactical systems struggled to categorize them. Not evasion patterns. They were too inconsistent to be patterns at all. The ships seemed to be making real-time decisions, individually, responding to what was directly in front of them rather than executing any predetermined plan. "They are improvising," Orten said. Thex frowned. "Improvisation in fleet combat is usually a sign of collapse." "Yes, but they are doing it intentionally." The distinction mattered enormously. Every Dominion battle model relied on a core assumption, that enemy forces would follow consistent tactical doctrine. The Hive was extraordinarily fast at identifying patterns, predicting movements, and optimizing counter-strategies. That was precisely how it had defeated every coalition fleet it had faced. But you cannot predict the behavior of a force that is not following a pattern. Within the first hour of the engagement, the Dominion fleet was doing something Orten had never observed in 2 years of war. It was reacting to the humans rather than controlling the engagement. Orten ran several simulations. The results confused him. He zoomed in on multiple separate engagements. Each human squadron appeared to be fighting completely differently. Different attack angles, different weapon combinations, different risk tolerances. No unified strategy. No consistent doctrine. Each unit making independent decisions. In real time. Which meant the Hive had to build a new counter-strategy for each of them. Separately. Simultaneously. Even at 3,000 adjustments per second, there were limits. "They're not just fighting the Dominion," Saravel said slowly, watching the display. "They're overwhelming the Hive's ability to predict them." Orten looked at the casualty statistics. Dominion losses were rising. Not dramatically, but noticeably. "Yes," he said quietly. "That is exactly what they are doing." The battle continued through the night. And by morning, the Dominion fleet had done something it had not done in months. It had adjusted its formation. Not because it wanted to, but because the humans had forced it to. The change in the war became visible after 10 days. Not dramatic, not sudden, but measurable. Inside the Coalition Command Center, General Orten stood before the tactical displays, studying the updated projections for the 3rd time that night. For 2 years, every chart in the system had moved in only one direction. Now the lines had begun to shift. Slowly. The Dominion fleet still held numerical superiority. Their ground forces still occupied large sections of Arkenfall, but the rate of loss had changed. For the first time in months, the enemy's perfect momentum had been broken. Ambassador Saravel had spent the week observing human battle reports. They were unlike any military records in Coalition archives. Coalition reports were structured, precise, and clean. Human reports often contained notes like, "Enemy tactics stopped working after 20 minutes. Sergeant Quan improvised new firing pattern. Unit changed approach mid-engagement." Each small adjustment forced the Dominion Hive to rebuild its battle models. Over and over again, the Hive was incredibly fast, but it was designed to optimize existing strategies. Humans kept inventing new ones, which meant the Dominion fleet had begun reacting instead of predicting. That alone had bought the Coalition precious time. But time alone would not win the war. General Mara Voss called a meeting at 3 in the morning. When the Coalition officers arrived in the human flagship strategy chamber, Voss was already waiting beside a large tactical display. Behind her, a map of the Dominion fleet rotated slowly. A dense cluster of ships surrounded a single highlighted structure near its center. She did not waste time. "That," she said, pointing to the marked section, "is the problem. The Dominion command vessel, or 10 confirmed. It coordinates the Hive communications for this battle zone," Saravel added. "Every signal passes through that ship. Every order, every tactical adjustment." Voss enlarged the image. At the center of the Dominion fleet floated a massive ship unlike the others, larger, slower, surrounded by layers of defensive vessels. Destroying it would disrupt their coordination, Hortense said. "For a time." "How long?" "If the relay core were destroyed completely, several hours." Several hours of confusion inside the Dominion fleet. Enough for the Coalition fleets to break the formation. Enough for ground forces to push back. Enough to change the direction of the war. Commander Thex spoke carefully. "We have considered this option before. And the approach is impossible. The command vessel sits inside the densest defensive formation in the Dominion fleet. No ship has ever reached it." "Not a fleet," Voss said. She changed the display. A narrow path appeared through the Dominion formation, an irregular route threading between patrol zones and defensive clusters. A strike team. Small ships. Fast. Low sensor signature. "You want to board the command vessel," Saravel said. "Yes." Hortense examined the model. "Survival probability extremely low." "I know." Commander Thex looked at her. "You cannot ask soldiers to attempt a mission with those odds." "I didn't." She tapped the display. A single number appeared. 4,312. The officer stared at it. "What is that?" Saravel asked. "Volunteers," Voss said. "After I explain the mission. After I explain the survival probability." She paused. 4,312 people raised their hands. Thex blinked. "You're serious?" "Completely." Hortense stared at the number. Statistically, it made no sense. He tried to imagine standing before 4,000 people, explaining that they would almost certainly die if they proceeded, and watching every single one of them volunteer anyway. The mathematics of it were incomprehensible to him. Not the calculation itself, which was simple, but the motivation behind it. He could not understand it. "You only need a small team," Saravel said slowly. 216, Voss replied. "That's how many insertion craft we can send." She glanced at the number on the display. "The rest stay here." Saravel imagined the conversation that had produced that number. He could not picture it. The meeting ended quickly after that. Preparations began immediately. Engineers modified 44 small insertion craft for stealth operations. Weapons specialists equipped the strike team with breaching charges and portable disruptor devices. The device itself, built to destroy the Hive relay core, had been designed by a young human engineer named Priya Chandrasekhar. She was 26 years old, had been working for 31 hours without sleep when she finished it, and when Coalition technicians examined her work, they noted that several of the components were technically substandard by galactic engineering norms. They tested it anyway. It worked perfectly. 7 days later, the strike team launched. Among the 216 soldiers was a 19-year-old infantryman named Cale Torres. He sat quietly in the cramped troop compartment of the insertion craft while the stars drifted past the viewing window. He had volunteered on the second day after Voss's announcement, standing in line behind several hundred other people who had gotten there first. He had not told anyone at home. He was not sure he could explain it in a way that would make sense. Across from him, Sergeant Ellis checked her weapon one last time. "You nervous?" she asked. "A little," Cale said. "That's normal." After a moment she asked, "Why'd you volunteer?" Cale thought about it. Then he answered simply. Seemed like the right thing to do. Ellis studied him for a moment. Then she nodded once and said nothing else. That was usually the reason. The craft continued its silent approach toward the heart of the Dominion fleet. The insertion began badly. 3 of the 44 craft were detected before they reached the Dominion fleet's outer defensive ring. The moment their sensor signatures spiked, Dominion drones surged toward them. The Coalition Command Center watched the tactical display in silence as the 3 signals vanished. Destroyed. The remaining 41 continued forward, flying dark and fast, threading between Dominion patrol paths with almost reckless precision. Every minute increased the chance of discovery. But the craft kept moving. Then the first wave reached the command vessel. 7 different insertion teams breached the outer hull almost simultaneously, using explosive charges to carve entry points into the enormous structure. Inside, the fighting began immediately. The corridors were narrow and dim, lined with dark organic metal grown directly from the hive's biological engineering. Dominion defenders rushed toward the breaches with mechanical speed. Human soldiers met them head-on. Weapons fire filled the tight corridors with flashes of light and thunderous echoes. The strike team pushed deeper, but the cost was immediate. In the first 15 minutes, more than 30 soldiers were killed clearing the outer chambers. Dominion drones fought without hesitation, throwing themselves forward in waves that forced the humans to advance room by room, step by step. 216 became 180, then 150. Still they pushed forward. On the Coalition flagship, Ortan watched the sensor feeds update. Small clusters of signals moved deeper into the command vessel. 1 signal vanished, then another, then 3 more. Commander Thex folded his arms tightly. "They are dying faster than the projections predicted." "Yes," Ortan said, but the surviving signals kept moving. Inside the Dominion vessel, Corporal Cale Torres ran through a smoke-filled corridor beside the 3 remaining members of his squad. They had lost the others at the previous junction, a Dominion ambush that had lasted 40 seconds and felt like an hour. The air smelled of burning metal and something organic and wrong. Weapons fire echoed somewhere ahead. Sergeant Ellis had been killed at the last junction. The memory burned in Cale's mind, vivid and immediate. The specific sound of it, the way she had still been looking at him when she fell, but there was no time to think about it. The relay core was close. He could feel the vibration of it through the floor now, a low pulse that seemed to travel up through his boots and settle somewhere in his chest. They reached the final chamber with 12 soldiers remaining. Dominion defenders waited inside. The fight lasted less than 2 minutes. When it ended, only 4 humans were still standing. The relay core towered above them, a massive structure pulsing with green light, surrounded by organic conduits carrying signals to the entire Dominion fleet. The room was hot and strange and smelled like something alive. Every few seconds the core pulsed, and when it did, Cale could see its light reflected in the faces of the 3 soldiers still standing with him. One of them activated the trigger for the disruptor device. Nothing happened. He checked it again. Still nothing. "We lost the remote detonator," he said. A moment of silence filled the chamber. For soldiers, 1 device, no trigger. Cale looked at the relay core, then at the device in his hands, then back at the others. "You need to go," he said. They looked at him. "Get back to the craft." "There's no time. There will be if you leave now." The others understood immediately. Someone had to stay behind. Cale was holding the device. The soldier closest to him hesitated, held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. They turned and ran. Cale waited until their footsteps disappeared down the corridor. Then he stepped toward the relay core. He could hear Dominion defenders approaching, the mechanical sound of drones in the corridors outside, growing louder. He didn't look toward the door. He looked at the core. He thought about Sergeant Ellis, about the way she had answered his question on the insertion craft. That's usually the reason, with the calm certainty of someone who had made peace with the same decision a long time ago. He thought about Davin down on the surface somewhere, staring up at the sky. He thought about the older soldiers in the trench, describing rivers and forests that didn't exist anymore. He placed the device against the core's outer shell and began manually connecting the energy leads. His hands were steady. Outside the chamber, the drones were very close now. He could hear them through the wall. He finished connecting the final wire. The device began to hum. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he pressed the manual activation switch. 90 seconds. He stood with his back against the relay core and watched the chamber door. The first drones came through at 30 seconds. He fired until the weapon ran dry, then used it as something else. And when that was done, he simply stood there, between the door and the device, giving it the only thing he still had left to give: time. At 90 seconds, every sensor array in the Arkenfall system registered the same event. The Dominion command vessel went dark. Not damaged, not disabled, dead. A silent shape drifting in space. And with it, the hive signal vanished. Across the battlefield, Dominion ships stopped firing. Drone swarms lost formation. Entire sections of the fleet drifted without coordination. The perfect machine of the Dominion war engine became, in an instant, thousands of disconnected parts, each one still dangerous, but no longer guided by the single intelligence that had made them unstoppable. In the Coalition Command Center, no one spoke. Then slowly, the tactical projections began updating. Dominion formations collapsing. Coalition ships advancing. Enemy fleets retreating. For the first time in 2 years, the Dominion was falling back. General Orten stared at the display. The numbers were shifting in ways his models had never predicted. He had spent 2 years building mathematical frameworks to understand this war. He had refined them hundreds of times. He had been meticulous and precise and thorough. None of it had accounted for this. For a long moment, he simply watched. Then the Sarati general did something no one in the room had ever seen him do. He turned toward the empty space where the Dominion command vessel had once transmitted its signals. And he bowed. Outside the command station windows, the Dominion fleet retreated from Arkenfall. Not chaotically, not in panic, but steadily, like a tide pulling back from a shore it had held for too long. The mathematics of the retreat were clean and logical, one final calculation from a mind that no longer had the support it needed. The Dominion did not flee. It withdrew, but it withdrew. On the surface of the planet, Coalition soldiers watched the sky slowly grow quiet. The explosions stopped. The clouds cleared. For the first time in months, the stars were visible. The actual stars, not the burning debris of things that had been ships an hour ago. Just stars. Steady and cold and still. Corporal Jalen Marek stood outside the ruined transport station and looked up for a long time. Davin stood beside him. "Are they leaving?" the boy whispered. "Looks like it." Davin stared at the silent sky. "Did we win?" Jalen thought about the battle above. About the ships that had come from a distant star, with their mismatched armor and their engines burning too hot. About the soldiers who had gone into the heart of the Dominion fleet with a handmade device and survival odds that no rational person would have accepted. He looked up at the stars, the ones the older soldiers used to describe, silver rivers and floating cities and all the things that were gone now and might someday be rebuilt. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think we did." 2 weeks later, the Coalition held a ceremony in the largest hall of the temporary command station. Representatives from every Coalition species attended. General Maravas stood beside Ambassador Saravel while the names of the strike team were read. 216 soldiers had launched. 201 had not returned. Each name was spoken slowly, clearly, with a pause after each one, as if the silence itself was part of the remembrance. No one in the hall moved while the list continued. When the final name was read, when the hall had been silent for several seconds, and no one seemed certain who was supposed to speak next, General Voss stepped forward. The Coalition presented her with their highest military honor. She accepted it quietly, without a speech. She looked at it for a moment, a small object, heavy with meaning, resting in her mechanical hand. And then she said something simple. "Make sure their names are remembered." Years later, the Battle of Arkenfall would be studied in military academies across the galaxy. Scholars tried to explain how the Dominion had been stopped. They analyzed battle data, fleet movements, engineering reports from the improvised ships, psychological profiles of human soldiers, the mathematics of the hive's response patterns. They found explanations for many things. But the final conclusion written in the official Coalition war history was surprisingly short. It read, "Humans do not fight because they know they will win. They fight because they cannot accept not trying. And that, the scholars concluded, was the most dangerous force in the galaxy.